Senator, you're watching what's going on tonight. I also want to get your thoughts on the COVID relief package being discussed and the violence and the idea of the president having the authority to help these cities, their outright rejection of any and all help.
Yeah, Sean, the violence that we see in Chicago tonight, like we've seen in Chicago and in New York and other cities over the last 2 months, is heartbreaking. These are our fellow citizens who deserve the protection of their local police and sheriff's departments. Unfortunately, you see in cities like Chicago or in Portland, you have far left-wing mayors who are essentially in league with these violent anarchists and rioters and looters. The mayor of Portland has allowed the federal courthouse and federal buildings there to be vandalized, to be defaced, to be firebombed. Of course, the federal government has to defend its property. And if these local mayors won't defend the lives and the property of their citizens, then they need to be able to look to the federal government to do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I'm concerned that there are now, with such a fierce, pathological hatred of the president. You know, when the president helped in Minneapolis, it worked. When he helped in D.C., it worked. It would work in New York. It would work in Portland. It would work in Seattle, and it would work in Chicago. We are the United States of America. We have the ability to protect our citizenry. President's right. This is a war zone. But then if the president goes in, he's hated. And then I guess, you know, the anarchists, they don't get any criticism from these Democratic mayors or governors. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the right call is, to be very blunt.
Well, it is hard for our federal officers, who aren't large in number across the country, to go into these cities where the local police have essentially been told to stand down. We've heard that repeatedly from our troopers out on the front lines, that they've been told by their local mayors to stand down and let this rioting and looting and anarchy happen. When you have just a handful of federal officers that can be deployed at any given time to one place, it's a challenge. And frankly, it's not a challenge that the numbers match up to. That's one reason why in early June it was essential to call out the National Guard. That's what ultimately allowed order to be restored in Washington, D.C. and Minneapolis and other cities. And like you, I think the Insurrection Act should be used as a last resort. But of course, the president has the power under the Insurrection Act, and he has the duty and the responsibility under the Constitution to protect the lives and the property of American citizens. And that means all lives, wherever they are.
Okay, so these mayors don't want them, these governors don't want them, Senator. They don't want them. They're allowing the anarchists to run wild. That we're losing, you know, maybe as many as 17 shot tonight in Chicago. They reject help in New York. They reject help in Chicago, Portland, Seattle, California, city after city. And I know what the result is going to be. You think the mass exodus out of New York and California has been big up to now after their horrific handling of COVID. And, of course, the anarchists. I see people exiting these cities in mass numbers over time, probably quicker out of New York, Chicago, and places like that.
Well, in some cases, it's really essential that the governors step in. I mean, the governors are ultimately responsible for their states as a whole. The power of cities and towns is ultimately derivative from state government. The governors have control of those National Guard elements in their state. And as we saw in early June, that's what helped stop a lot of the rioting and the looting and the anarchy. But when we see dozens of our fellow citizens killed in the streets of Chicago and in New York, we ought to have zero tolerance for that. This is what happens whenever you restrain the police, when you condemn the police, when you don't allow them to do the job
Tom
they're
Cotton
sworn to do,
walked through
which is
with me,
protect the
Senator.
safety.
If federal troops are brought in, and then, of course, the mayors and the governors, they're not stopping the anarchists, and there's chaos on the streets, and then they go, the leading, the people leading some of these movements, been 156, I believe, arrested because of the Department of Justice. And then they have to fire to protect themselves or others. Who gets the blame for that?
Well, ultimately, the blame lies with criminals who are doing things like firebombing federal buildings or pelting frozen water bottles or sharpened sticks at police officers in Chicago, or looting and rioting in cities like Washington and New York. The president was right in early June when he urged governors to call out their National Guards, not only to stop the crime that was happening on their streets, but to deter it from stopping in the first place. And again, ultimately, the power of cities is derivative from the power of state governments, and that's why the governors are in charge of their National Guards. And in places where they can't control crime on the streets, it's the governor's responsibility to step in and ensure that the lives and the property of their citizens are protected.
All right, stay right there. Senator Tom Cotton joining us now. We have Brittany Carzia. Apparently we don't have her on the line. Dan Bongino, though, is back with us. Dan, let me go back to you. And, you know, we're watching this whole thing unfold, and I think this is now an extreme. I think the failure, well, apparently we're staying with Tom Cotton now. You know, I think the failure, Senator, of these mayors and these governors is now paramount. Let me go to the COVID issue and the president's press conference today. Number one, there was so much hope. As it relates to therapeutics, so much hope as it relates to a vaccine. We'd never broken down the sequence of a virus that quickly. So much hope in terms of all of the governors that have asked for things have gotten everything they wanted. Federal officials on the ground in 9 states sent by the president. We're using thousands of troops, National Guard troops, California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. All of that happening, and then you have the media in this country that hates Donald Trump so much they don't even want to report it.
Well, yeah, most networks other than this one, Sean, I don't think even picked up the president's remarks until they got to the question and answer period, whenever the reporters could try to steal center stage. But as you say, there was a lot of good news that the president conveyed today in terms of progress made on treatment regimens and potential vaccines by the end of the year. You know, our case rates are going up across the country, but the death rates and the hospitalization rates are not going up as fast. Why is that? Because our great doctors and scientists have learned so much about this virus over the last 3 and 4 months. That's one reason why we wanted to put our guard up in March and April and spread out infections over the space of a longer time, so we could learn more about the virus and we could treat better those people who have the virus. We could learn what populations are most at risk, like nursing homes and long-term care facilities, and what we need to do to protect them more effectively.